You're watching LMCC.
Thank you, and we'll just jump right into it. The cover picture here is Hotel Lafayette. It's just an artistic rendering of the hotel over in Minnetonka Beach. Lake Minnetonka was first rediscovered by European settlers in 1852 by Simon Stevens and Calvin Tuttle. And these weren't just ordinary citizens, they were leading citizens of the day. In fact, Calvin Tuttle was the treasurer for the territory of Minnesota. They came out in April of 1852, and this is essentially what they found the conditions of Lake Minnetonka. This is a map from about 1856. You can see there's only one connection between the upper and lower lake, being Hull's Narrows. It had such an undulating shoreline of 125 miles that they called it Peninsula Lake. 2 weeks later, they brought the very first tourist to Lake Minnetonka, Territorial Governor Alexander Ramsey, who didn't like the name Peninsula Lake especially well. So he took on the Dakota moniker Minnetonka for Big Water. The initial interests for tourists to Lake Minnetonka included several things. Hunting was on the very forefront. It was still a wilderness. Game was still, rife around the lake. Here you can see this is Spirit Knob over in what's now Woodland, and they have muskets and powder horns there. Fishing was also real popular in those early days and into the 1870s. Catching a 10-pound northern pike was common. This is the back step of Sampson House, which was over on 2nd Street in Excelsior. You can see the man in the background there would be Leroy Sampson, and his father in front of him to the right, Francis Sampson. And then over here we have Charlie Sampson and Frank Sampson. Health reasons were another reason to come to Lake Minnetonka. Here you can see a couple pamphlets, a plea for cold climates, pulmonary consumption, Minnesota as a health resort, climatology and epidemics of Minnesota, and Minnesota as home for invalids. At that time there was, yeah, sounds real appealing. But there was a branch of medicine called climatology, and they believed that by changing your climate you could cure yourself. And they were trying to get away from malaria and tuberculosis, those two in particular. And there was a little bit of reality to what they were trying to do. The incidences of those cases were far lower than, say, in Missouri or Louisiana, partly because we get the winter kills off the mosquitoes, so there's not as much malaria here in Minnesota. But and there were some that found benefit, but there were very few. Most of those people that came here with TB or malaria, they would just die here in Minnesota instead of the state they were from. But a lot of the Southerners were also coming to Minnesota to escape those illnesses and weren't coming with the disease itself. This is Dr. LaPaul's electrical apparatus, and this was another medical whiz-bang in Excelsior. Dr. LaPaul had a hotel, his Hotel LaPaul, up behind where the Dock Theater is, and he had this electrical apparatus starting in the 1890s, and he brought this machine out to Excelsior in 1911 and set it up here. And basically, you just sat down in it. He plugged it in, and whiz bang, you're cured. He got into a little bit of trouble. Here's his ad, and this was all over in newspapers and city directories, telephone book type directories, and he was censured by the Minnesota Medical Association for advertising. And he countered that by saying, well, you're just jealous because I'm actually getting results from the machine and you're not doing it right. He was the lone dissenting vote for the censure by the Minnesota Medical Association. And if you take a closer look, these are the things that he said that he could cure: backaches, kidney disease, tumors, nervous exhaustion, rheumatism, female weakness, and male weakness. No idea what that is. Social events were also very popular. When we had the grand hotels around, there were what they called hops, which were balls. This is a formal opening of Hotel St. Louis, 1894. And down at the very bottom, you can see informal hop Tuesday evenings, full dress or formal hop on Saturday evenings. So on those Saturday evenings, they would get their finest clothes out and go to the ball. And then the next round of news, the next edition of the newspaper would have a write-up of what each one of the women was wearing. There were athletic events as well. Here you can see 8-man sculls out on Lake Minnetonka. This is a regatta from the 1890s, but it wasn't just a sport for participants. This was a spectator sport as well. You can see the Hattie Mae, which is the large stern wheel paddle boat to the right, and another steamboat, and they're just kind of trailing along watching the progression of the race. Sailing has also been important to Lake Minnetonka and continues to be to this day. This is taken from Lighthouse Island, where the Minnetonka Yacht Club is. Cottage Wood is in the distance, and you can see a bunch of catboats and sloops, at the start of the race. And the first races that I was able to document occurred in 1869. And of course, boys, you get two things that go fast, and there's going to be a race. Tennis, the Northwestern Lawn Tennis Tournament. They had these starting in the 1890s and went on for a couple decades over at the Burton Estate in Chimo. Bowling was also very popular, and bowling alleys developed everywhere. There were at least 4 that developed in Excelsior itself before 1900. This is the casino, which stood at the end of Water Street in Excelsior. It's a 6-lane bowling alley. And there was another that was attached to the White House, and Mayor Milner, who had his house over at the end of 3rd Street, right on Gideon's Bay, he had a bowling alley. But there were bowling alleys at the Hotel St. Louis, at Lafayette, at the Del Botero. They were all over. This was just a real big fad of the time. For the more genteel, croquet, man's upper Lake Park over where Edgewood is today. But some people didn't really think this was much of a sport. Would the opponents of boxing matches, professional baseball, rowing regattas, etc., have sport denigrated to this? Getting to Lake Minnetonka was an arduous task in the very beginning. Here you can see the one on the left says, "For Lake Minnetonka, Mr. Hezekiah Brake has put out a team and spring wagon to carry passengers regularly between this city and Excelsior on Lake Minnetonka. For the present, but 1 trip a week is made, leaving Excelsior every Friday morning and St. Paul to return every Saturday morning at 8 o'clock, starting from the Merchants Hotel. Heretofore, there has been great inconvenience in reaching this desirable point. Visitors and others will now have the opportunity of seeing one of the largest and most beautiful lakes in Lake Minnetonka." That's from the St. Paul Pioneer and Democrat, 1856. 3 years later, it wasn't too much different. Cheap, Mr. Charles Galpin runs a regular stage starting on Tuesday of each week from Minneapolis to Glencoe and Henderson via Excelsior, and the fare for the whole distance, 60 miles, is only $2.50. So big step up that you're actually getting to, a regular stagecoach type, vehicle in 1859, but in 1856 it's just a buckboard and you're out there bouncing around. This is one way to get from Minneapolis and St. Anthony to Excelsior, but the more common route was to take a steamboat up the Minnesota River to Shakopee, and then overland it's only 4 or 5 miles instead of the 15 to 20 from Minneapolis. That's through swamps and all that. So it changed considerably once they got here. This is the very first steamboat on Lake Minnetonka, the Governor Ramsey. It was launched in 1860 by Charles Galpin, who had the stagecoach in 1859, so he could bring them here and then transport them to any place on the lake. Getting to Lake Minnetonka changed dramatically on August 24th, 1867, and here you can see the very first passenger train of the St. Paul and Pacific Railroad reaching Wayzata. And the Governor Ramsey, at this time called Lady of the Lake, is meeting the boat to take passengers to Excelsior, because really, Wayzata, it's like... Because this is what Lake Wayzata looked like in 1867. There really wasn't much there. Here you can see the line going across here, right along the lake shore, of course, is the railroad, newly developed, and there are only but a few buildings in all of Wayzata. Days Hotel, Barton's boarding house, the Wayzata House, and Blaisdell's boarding house. There just wasn't a lot. And then, there's a potash factory, and that's about it. So Excelsior really was the place to go. Transportation on the lake turned real big in 1881 when William D. Washburn launched the city of St. Louis. Washburn was United States Senator from Minnesota, and he was also president of the Minneapolis-St. Louis Railroad. And this was the very first inland lake steamboat with electric lights, 160 feet long and a 30-foot beam. So this was a real big boat. And on the side, you can see here, on the wheelhouse, there's an image of Fort Snelling. And then in this image, on the other side of the wheelhouse, is Eads Bridge in St. Louis, which was built 1874, the first steel-constructed bridge spanning the Mississippi River. It really was the gateway to the West. Coming in 1882, the year after, was this boat, the Belle of Minnetonka, 285 feet long and 60-foot beam, so 60 feet across. So this was the largest boat ever put on Lake Minnetonka. People compared it to Noah's Ark. But it really was too much boat for Lake Minnetonka. When news got out that Hill was going to put this on the lake, Washburn, owner of the city of St. Louis, wrote him letter after letter pleading him, don't do this, there's not enough traffic on the lake. You have your railroad, I have mine. I will sell you half of the city of St. Louis and we'll operate them, in conjunction with both railroads to meet each of the railroad schedules. Hill just ignored him, and he just went ahead and did his own thing, putting the biggest boat out on Lake Minnetonka. They said it could handle 2,500 passengers at a time. So, yeah, that's a lot of people. And on this boat, there were 2 restaurants. There were 2 dance halls that each had their own orchestra on it. And I heard once that they sold $5,000 worth of booze in a day, and drinks were 25 cents each. Excelsior was a dry town, but not on the lake. So that gives us pause for our first commercial interruption from our sponsor here, Excelsior Brewing Company. EBCO, way much more flavorfuller than H2O. It is not a sin if you're thirsty to get up and go over to the bar during this presentation and get a refill. Now we get to the nitty-gritty with the hotels. And this is a chart that I developed myself from my research. And you can see how it takes off from 1853 and all the way through 1920. And you can see kind of a peak right at 1884, 1885. You have those large hotels that are already on the lake. And then it kind of takes a turn for the worse in the 1890s. And that's when, and then it comes back a little bit more, but those are much smaller hotels that are coming on after the big ones are starting to fail, because after 1886, the big ones never were attracting the big crowds. And then it really starts to fall off in 1914 with the start of World War I. And that's where we're going to have a little bit of a game. Blaze or raise. You know what happened to these hotels, so let's take a look at what happens to the hotels along the way. We'll start with the grand hotels of Lake Minnetonka. There were 3 of them. The first one was Hotel St. Louis, and it was built in 1879 by a trio of people that had ties to Winchester, Kentucky, of all places, where my brother-in-law was born. It was Thomas M. Edgington, Major Thomas A. Harrow, and George M. Jackson. And Jackson and Harrow had since moved to St. Louis, Missouri, and were operating businesses there, summering in Lake Minnetonka. And Edgington had come to Lake Minnetonka for the first time in 1877. They bought this parcel of land from Charles Gibson and constructed this building here. The front, it was 4 stories. Originally, the top story was reserved for hotel staff, but it was 215 feet long, and it had 2 wings taking off on each side that were 127 feet long. So this was an enormous hotel. It had 4.5 miles of electric wire in it and no electric lights. So each one of these cords ran to each one of the rooms. People were able to push a button, and then a steward or porter would come to the room to check on to see what they wanted. It became contentious almost from the get-go. Thomas Edgington died just weeks after the hotel was opened up, and he was the money behind it. He had about $60,000 wrapped up in the hotel. He was at the time known as the Kentucky Millionaire, but only had about $100,000 of his own money, which is still a lot in 1879. But then Harrow decided, well, if we don't do something, we're gonna get the shaft on this project, and we won't get any money from it. And Harrow and Jackson had put a lot of time and effort into it. Harrow came up with a scheme to completely take the hotel away from Edgington's widow. And Jackson wouldn't have any of it. And in the lobby of the hotel, Harrow tried to pull a gun from his pocket, and the hammer got stuck on his clothing, so he started pulling out a knife, and Jackson just barely got away with his life, and eventually Harrow was forced out of the situation and paid off and told never to come back. Well, he didn't come back, but he went up to the Upper Lake to Shady Island, took over a hotel there, but he called Hotel Harrow. Eventually, the hotel was bought by Charles Gibson and some of his people from the Lindell Hotel Company in St. Louis, Missouri. And in the 1890s, Gibson foreclosed on that group and took over the property himself. And you can see the big hotel. It operated until 1904 as a hotel, and then in 1905, following the fire of the Minnetonka Ice Yacht Club, it became the headquarters for the Ice Yacht Club there. It didn't operate in 1906. Anybody have a guess at what happened to this hotel? It was torn down. This is in May of 1906 that they announced that the hotel was going to be razed, and it didn't happen until early 1907. The Lake Park Hotel was created by the Minnetonka Lake Park Association over in Tonka Bay, and it was over 300 feet long, and you can see that the big tower there, they had 4 different towers. This is the large one. It was 95 feet tall. So you get up there and you can see above the trees, every direction. You can pretty much see every part of Lake Minnetonka from the top of that hotel. They had a Chautauqua type organization for that first year of 1879, religious exercises, Sunday sermons, and weekday Sunday school classes. It only lasted a year before it was a failed endeavor because they ran out of money. You can see in 1879, for 1880, they added 3 stories to it. And by the time the expansion was over in 1883, they had nearly 300 rooms in this hotel. So enough room for 700 people or so. Thomas Lowry was in charge of he was court-appointed administrator for the bankruptcy of the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad. And the railroad had put in money into the hotel and extended its rails to the hotel in 1884. So that's how Lowry initially got control of half of the hotel. But in 1902, he acquired full control of the hotel, and he wanted to create an experiment and monopolize the lake traffic on Lake Minnetonka. He bought the hotel, painted it white, put all new verandas on it, renamed it the Tonka Bay Hotel. And in 1913, the building was torn down. He didn't last too long. The last 2 years, 1911 and 1912, it had turned into a Jewish summer camp for Jewish children. Here you can see it in the midst of being torn down. And this is Hotel Lafayette over in Tonka Bay, the largest hotel on all of Lake Minnetonka, built by James J. Hill. And in the foreground here, you can see this long level spot. He owned a railroad. So all the materials that went into the building of the hotel, he had a railroad spur built right to the front of the hotel. So all the material was offloaded directly onto the site. The original building in 1882 ended right here. Before the hotel even opened, with all the reservations they had, they knew it wasn't going to be big enough. So that following winter, as soon as the last person left the hotel in October of '82, they started the expansion. When it was finished, it was 800 feet long, and each room had its own call button as well, just like Hotel St. Louis. It cost over $350,000 just to build the hotel. So the Hotel St. Louis at $65,000 was a relative bargain. Here you can see a floor plan of the hotel. 403 rooms. So this place could house 1,000 people without too much problem. There were, interesting things: a wine room, ticker and telegraph room, cashier, private dining. it had an elevator. It was probably the first hydraulic elevator in Minnesota. The hydraulic elevator was invented in 1879, just 3 years before this hotel was built. You can also see where it says open space going all the way up. They had skylights at the top of the building, huge skylights. And they would open up the doors and then open up the skylights, and it acted just like a chimney. So all that ventilation, it would just take all that hot air right out of the hotel and keep it as cool as it possibly could on a summer 95-degree day in Minnesota. One of the things that I find most interesting are the toilets, and you can't see it over here. It's ladies' toilet there, ladies' toilet, ladies' toilet. There's no toilets on the fourth floor, but on the third floor is the only one that isn't labeled ladies. So if you were a man, that's it, brother. I mean, there on these stairways over here, the carpet must have had a real worn pattern in it. And these were expensive carpets. They came from Marshall Fields in Chicago. Here you can see just the vastness of the hotel from Lafayette Bay. You can see a steamboat approaching the dock over here. This is an amusement hall and railroad station and boat dock, and they had bowling alleys there. Anybody guess what happened to this building? It burned down. And here you can see all they had had with it was boatmen fought the flames with hand grenades. Well, in those days, hand grenades for fighting fires, they were glass balls filled with fire retardant. And they were thin glass, you just throw them in there. Well, previously the water had all been turned off to the hotel. This was October 4th, 1897. So there wasn't any water to fight the fire. Nobody died. That was a saving grace. They only had $65,000 worth of insurance on it. And some people have said that, well, you burned it for the insurance money. Well, in this day and age, buildings like this were raised, and the materials salvaged. So how much could he have gotten for the contents of the hotel? All the beds, silverware, which was real silver, and the carpets, the windows, doors, the woodwork, maybe 60,000, I don't know. So probably not done for insurance purposes. He sold the property to the Minnetonka Club in 1899. In 1900, they built this building, which became the Lafayette Club. That burned in 1922, in which 2 people died, and then the current clubhouse was built in 1924. Here's a pamphlet, the Act to Regulate Commerce, comprising the Interstate Commerce Law. 1886, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which regulated railroad traffic. And that was the chief way of people getting to Minnesota and to Lake Minnetonka, was via railroad. Before 1887, when the act was finally implemented, railroads could charge nominal rates over heavily traveled routes. So it was much cheaper to travel, say, from Chicago to Minneapolis than it was from Bismarck, North Dakota, where all you had was wheat fields that traveled on the railroad, seed in the spring, grain in the fall. So they charged exorbitant rates. The Interstate Commerce Act leveled that so that system-wide the rates had to be evened out. So the heavily traveled areas would have to supplement those low traveled areas. And so that raised the rates for railroad passengers getting to Minnesota. And following 1886, None of the big hotels operated a profit except for Hotel St. Louis for a couple of years in the early 1890s. Here you can see a letter written to James J. Hill by Charles Zimmerman, who was in charge of his fleet of boats on Lake Minnetonka. And it's October 8, 1887. The operation of the interstate law cut off particularly our eastern and southern travel. The eastern resorts, a gain of over 30%, while our falling off was fully that. We had a rainy 4th of July, which cost us dearly, and to cap the climax, we had 16 days of rain in the month of August. So right there, you can see the vast impact that Congress had on the hotel tourist industry of Lake Minnetonka. Following that, there was a general decline. There was the Panic of 1893 that further cut into any kind of travel from out-of-state visitors, which resulted in Lake Minnetonka becoming a cottage industry. And it was just more local Twin City families from St. Paul and Minneapolis that would come and visit the lake, and they would not need the hotels because they had their house in Minneapolis and they had their own little cottage on the lake. And so you can see here the newspaper, 1895, the Excelsior Cottager, successor to the Minnetonka News. This is the local Excelsior paper, recognizing the trend of what's happening around the lake. This is the first cottage on Lake Minnetonka, a summer cottage. This is built by Samuel Gale. He and his brother Harlow came in the early 1850s to St. Anthony. And in 1867, he built this house over in what's now Woodland. It's his summer house. And at that time, 1867, the St. Paul Pacific Railroad comes to Wayzata. All he needs to do is row across Wayzata Bay, get on the train, and he can go to work every day. So he's the first commuter. This is when Lake Minnetonka became a suburb of Minneapolis. It eventually started leasing it in 1876 to James Barton, who was kind of expelled from Wayzata for shooting off Horace Gleason's leg with a shotgun. And he named it Maplewood Inn. It progressed through a series of hands from that, all leases from Samuel Gale. It became known as the Phipps House in the 1890s, and then was Mrs. Abrams returned the name to Maplewood. Any idea what happened to this house? Maplewood burns, October 8, 1903. And this is Charles Gibson's house in Northholm, the first of the grand lake cottages on Lake Minnetonka over in Northholm in Deep Haven. It was built by Robert McGrath, the very first resident of Excelsior, and it was built 1875 to 1876. And then burned in 1895. Now, Thomas Lowry, I talked about him, and he was trying to do kind of what James J. Hill had done before. He bought the Lake Park Hotel in 1902 and all the surrounding unsold lots of land. So that was using the hotel to attract people to the lake and sell them the lots for cottages so they could build their own cottages. To further monopolize the lake, he brought in his street railroad cars in 1905 to Excelsior. In 1906, he got all of his streetcar boats and 3 ferry boats. The streetcar boats would take you to just about any place on Lake Minnetonka that you could dream of going. And he also, in 1906, opened Big Island Amusement Park, and those 3 ferry boats would take them across the lake to the amusement park. Now here you can see a little map showing the red dotted lines. This is where all the streetcar boats went, and you go all the way over to Wayzata, Spring Park, Minnetonka Beach. At one point, they were even going to Mound, but you can see Zumbra Heights, and it's like, there's nothing in Zumbra Heights. And you wonder why he would go there, why the boats would go there. Well, Calvin Goodrich lived there, and he was vice president of the streetcar company. So he needed to get to work. Overall, Thomas Lowry spent $1.5 million by 1907 on this whole endeavor of monopolizing Lake Minnetonka tourist industry. 1907 was the start of a national recession. The whole endeavor just collapsed. People couldn't come out to Big Island Amusement Park. They couldn't afford the quarter fare to get out from the city out to the lake. By 1911, everything collapsed. Big Island Amusement Park was gone. The Tonka Bay Hotel was closed. The streetcar boats stopped in 1926. And on August 11th, 1932, his streetcars were replaced by buses. This is in front of what is now Red Sauce Rebellion in Excelsior. Bacon drug. So our next commercial intermission. Now we move on specifically to Excelsior. And once you got on to one of those steamboats that getting dropped off the train at Wayzata, they transported you instantly to Excelsior. And here's the main dock. The dock that you see right here is right where all the charter boats are today. And this is the Excelsior House, which is back up on the hill. It was, at this time in 1876, the largest hotel on Lake Minnetonka. It became the largest hotel in 1866 when this part of the building was built. And then in 1874, the portion to the left was built. It remained the largest hotel on the lake until 1879 with the opening of the Hotel St. Louis. Here you can see that same area right again in 1879, the same pavilion, boat landing in Excelsior. And this is Excelsior in 1879. Here you can see the White House right here, Water Street coming through here, the barn of the Excelsior House there, and Morse's Dance Hall, the Gates and Dunlap Boat Pavilion. So Center Street would be somewhere right about in there. In 1882, here you can see the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad. It reached Excelsior in 1881, and you can see the city of St. Louis there, the White House, Hotel St. Louis. It's hard to make it out on the screen, but the brand new Belle of Minnetonka on the distant shore. This is 1882 Excelsior. And then we move to 1888, and over here you can see the spire for the Congregational Church, Korzek Boarding House, the White House there. At this time, there's no Excelsior House. The Motorline Pavilion. This is the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba Railroad that was right down what is now Lake Street. And the Belle of Minnetonka, the Stetson House, and Calorama Cottage. You can see this was a really, really busy place. There was a lot of commerce and a lot of people coming in and through Excelsior. In fact, this is an 1887 base map, and I've gone through it colored where there were hotels and named boarding houses in Excelsior. So these were all going concerns that were advertising in the local papers. There's 22 of them, and that doesn't include just the mom and pop people who were taking in 3, 4, maybe 5 boarders during the summer. They weren't included any of this. These were regular ongoing concerns. Here you can see Excelsior 1882, and this is 2nd Street. So, and this is School Avenue right here. And Water Street goes right down the middle, and you can see Central Boarding House, the original Slater Boarding House, Newell's Drug, where Weymouth's Drug, that's the building that it became, the Excelsior House, Longview House, White House. This is a big going place. 1881, they got side boardwalks going up 2nd Street. The first sidewalks in Excelsior were laid down Water Street in 1879. But I talked to you about the Excelsior House, and over here you can see the roof of it over there. That's the original portion of the house, as the 3rd frame building in all of Excelsior, built in 1853 for George Galpin. In 1866, this section was made, and in 1874, the other section was made. He sold the hotel to James Letson in 1870. And Letson lived in, Letson was the son-in-law of William Wallace Waite, who bought it. Waite was still living in Chicago, so he leased the hotel to William and Julia Simpson, who owned the White House across the street. And part of the lease agreement said they had to paint the hotel, build a cistern, and that they could use any of the wood that they owned on adjacent properties over in what's now Tonka Bay to heat the hotel. Well, they took that a little bit too far. They started clear cutting the land and selling the wood for their own use and pocketing the profits from it. So the next year, Waite came to Excelsior, and he took over the hotel himself. This is how it looked in 1886. Any idea what happened to this hotel? It burned. Following a New Year's Eve party, it had been closed for the season, but they opened it up for a New Year's Eve party on December 31st, 1886. And half an hour after everybody left, all of a sudden, it was going up. Well, it remained vacant for a number of years, and this is where Dr. LaPaul built his hotel. And it's an impressive structure. It's finished in 1896. And he owned it until 1918, when he sold it to Richard Golden. Golden then leased it for that first year to Emily Goodrich, who called it the Goodrich House. But then Golden took it over and named it the Excelsior Bay Hotel. He operated the hotel until 1928. Any ideas? Right across the street, the White House, and it was right across Water Street from where the Excelsior Bay Hotel was. And the original portion of this is right over here. It was built in 1853 by Dr. Ebenezer Snell of the Northampton, Massachusetts water cure. And this was a whole thing, the water cure. He operated as a sanitarium, and it was based on exercise and proper diet. He could house about 20 people in the one small house, and then they had another building that was ancillary to that. He sold it and moved to Minneapolis in 1862. In 1864, Anderson and Julia Jenkins bought it, and they continued it as a boarding house. And in 1868, Anderson died. And in 1870, Julia remarried to William Simpson, and this became known as the Simpson House. In 1874, they added this grand two and a half story addition to the hotel. And in 1880, they got rid of the original portion of the building, moved it off a little bit, and replicated the 1874 construction. At that point, they painted it blazing white, and because it was so white, that's when it got the name the White House. Julia and then her daughter and son-in-law Frank Bardwell operated the hotel into the 1900s and then started leasing it to a guy named Sanderson. The Bardwell family owned it until 1921 when they sold it to the Lake Minnetonka Women's Club, who operated this as a community center and Excelsior's very first public free library. They continued to operate until 1928 when they could no longer afford it, and they deeded it over at no cost to the Minnesota State Sunshine Society. And the Sunshine Society offered vacations to inner city people who couldn't really afford it, so it was kind of a charity event. And for 2 weeks each summer, they had like a camp just for people who were blind. And this is a rear view of the White House. This is Water Street coming along right here. That's the same view today. Any idea what happened to the White House? It was torn down in 1946 to make way. They tore it down and then they graded the hill. It was about 20 feet tall, so the top of the top of the hill would have been halfway through the tower of what Haskell's is now. This is the new Slater House. It was built in 1882. It was at the intersection of School Avenue and 2nd Street. It was built by George and Marilla Slater. And they eventually sold it in 1884 to Leroy and Eliza Sampson. And it became known as Sampson House, which you see here in 1885. They brought this building in from over on 3rd Street and used that as an annex. And then by 1889, they had brought it forward, attached it to the building, and put in a 3rd story. They just jacked the roof up and slipped another story in there. So this is a Sampson House. Anybody here old enough to remember this building? You remember this building? What happened to it?
Cliff Anderson.
It was burned in 1893. We got some real old timers here tonight. But as you remember, 1893, there was the Panic of 1893. It took a couple of years before Leroy Sampson could finally rebuild. So in the fall of 1896, that's when it was, he had his new hotel rebuilt, which you may well remember. But here you can see this would be School Avenue right here, and then this is the tip of 2nd Street going down. This is how it looked in about 1920. And then in 1937, they added a coating of the asbestos siding to it. This is the hotel in 1942. And in 1962, it was torn down. And that's what's there today. Carriage Hill. This is the original Slater house right here that was built by George and Marilla Slater in 1880. And after it was completed and opened, they owned it for 2 weeks before they sold it to Mahala Beers. And she called it Apple Door House because right in front of the front doors were a couple of apple trees. 2 years later, she renamed it Vermont House for the state that she was born in. And in 1892, it was sold to Horace de Groot and called the Central Boarding House. And it was destroyed in the fire of 1895. January 1st, another New Year's party gone wrong in Excelsior that destroyed the entire west half of Water Street between 2nd and 3rd Street. So every building except for the one right on 3rd Street, the entire block was destroyed. The only reason that one was saved is because there were about 3 empty lots between it and the fire. And that's the same view today. So this would have stood right about in here between the sitting room and Martin's. Now Mahala Beers, after she got rid of her Apple Door House and Vermont House, in 1887, she had this hotel built, which is Beers Hotel. And over here was, appropriately for Mrs. Beers, the first saloon in Excelsior. In the 1890s, it was called the Windsor Hotel, and then it last operated as a hotel in 1913. It was in 1930, in August of 1930, the top floor was taken off and it was turned into a Red Owl store. Anybody have any ideas what happened to this building? And that's where what it looks like today. So it would have stood right where Red Sauce Rebellion is today. Now here's a building called Ball's Bank Block. And that refers to a man named Minor Ball, who was president of the Excelsior Bank. So here you can see the bank entrance. It's hard to read it on this, but it says Excelsior House right here. This was built in 1886, but it didn't become a hotel until 1890. And there's W.B. Mason opened up the first hotel there. He called it the Lakeside Palace Hotel. Now, it's not really much of a palace, and it certainly isn't lakeside, but it had room for about 15 guests. The following year, it was transferred to a man named Batchelor, and he changed the name to Excelsior House. In 1892, Minor Ball decided, I'm going to take a crack at this boarding house hotel business. And he took over the place, and he had recently become a vegetarian for his health, and he said it made a real big difference. He died 2 years later. It continued to operate as a hotel. It became known as Lakeview Hotel in 1898. Does anybody remember where this was located? It was burned May 4, 1898. And it also has the distinction of being the only building dynamited in Excelsior. 4 years later, the shell of the building was still standing, and people were so sick and tired of it. All of a sudden, one day, a huge explosion that rocked the whole city, and part of the walls came down, but not enough. 2 weeks later, more dynamite. The city council finally got the message, and then they paid for the demolition of the building. Anybody know where this hotel was? This building was called the Pleasant Grove Hotel. It was built in 1867 by Morris and Ellen Pease. Morris died in 1870, and Ellen remarried to Edwin Page in 1875, at which time it became known as Page's Boarding House. In 1879, they added onto it greatly. You can see the original part of the house right here, the broadside gabled end on it, right, the gabled end sticking out right there is the original 1867 part. This was added in 1879 and then there was another addition added also that year off the back. So this had over 20 rooms for rent, so 75 people could stay at the Pleasant Grove House. This was over on 2nd Street, just a couple hundred feet up from West Lake Street. Anybody know what happened to this house? It still stands at 185 West Lake Street. The additions have been taken off, but the original building is still there. Here's the Maple Inn, and this was found to be relocated to this site right about 1900 and opened up as a boarding house at that time. In 1906, the Getsky family bought it, Theodore Getsky, and they continued to operate it as Maple Inn until 1913, at which time it just became a single-family residence. Any idea what happened to this? It's still there, 441 2nd Street. Bev likes the color. Here we have, you can see it right on the side of the sign, Fred Hawkins Hotel and Cafe. Fred Hawkins came to Excelsior with the interest in opening a saloon. And first he got the Welter building right here, and he took over the liquor license of the people who had leased that from the Welter family. And then he bought this lot in 1905 and built that building there, and then had doors cut in between the buildings so that he could run both in conjunction with each other. He ran afoul one too many times of the law in Excelsior about the prohibition on selling alcohol, and in 1913 he was arrested for selling liquor without a license. He was jailed, but the city gave him an offer he couldn't refuse. They told him, "We won't prosecute you, but you can never come back to Excelsior." He was literally run out of town. And today, it's still there. Right next door to Leipold's. Here you can see Hunt's Boarding House. Was it Dana C. and Arvilla Hunt. They constructed the building in 1872. It was also known as Prospect Hill. And you think, well, this is over on 3rd Street, so what's with that? I mean, but you have to realize, here's the Congregational Church, so 3rd Street's just the other side. This is still really high up, so if you're up on the 2nd floor you can get a really good view of Lake Minnetonka in the 1870s because there are no trees in Excelsior, and you can see clear across over those buildings that were over on 2nd Street. Here you can see it from 3rd Street side. And this is Hunt's boarding house, Prospect Hill, was the site of the very first meeting of Excelsior Masonic Lodge in 1875. And here you can see the Masons trying to dress like they thought people would look like in 1875. But, well, you know Masons. I know Masons. There's one sitting right there, my father. This building was destroyed in October of 1955 to make way for the east parking lot. So it stood just up here on 3rd Street, just before you get to the Congregational Church. And this is the DeGroote's summer boarding house. And it was built by Peter and Clara DeGroote in 1876. They were transplants from Carver, Minnesota, where they had also operated a hotel. It stood over on 3rd Street. Anybody have any ideas what happened to this? 1887. Their son Horace DeGroote had been operating the hotel at the time, and he went on later to operate another hotel in Excelsior. Today, that's the same view. And this portion right here was the only portion of the DeGroote summer house that was saved. So this is the original 1876 portion of the hotel. It's now where Dan Johnson lives. And this was, it says Hotel DeGroote, and this was Horace DeGroote from the DeGroote Summer House. It was built in 1885 by the DeGroote brothers, Llewellyn and George. Llewellyn was an architect and contractor. It stood up on Center Street and Lake Street. And in 1892 was when the DeGroote, Horace DeGroote took it over, and he operated it for until 1898. And then Elizabeth Buxton took it over and called it the Bel Alto Hotel. And in 1903, Ella Donaldson bought it and called it Donaldson House. Any ideas? It was purchased in 1917 by, I think it was Roger Clements, and it was torn down to make way for a bungalow that's still there today. We got Calorama Cottage, which was built for Henrietta F. Tucker in 1884. It was originally just a duplex, but in 1885 she opened it up as a boarding house, and it continued as a boarding house until 1913. In 1903, it was briefly known as the Aloha Hotel. Anybody have any ideas what happened to this? It's still there today. 262 Lake Street. So it's right next door to that Stetson House, the DeGroote Hotel. Here's another one, Darnell's Boarding House, Amanda Darnell. And this is just up the road here on 3rd Street. Don Douglas did all the work and salvaging this and restoring it. And you think, what a rotten location for a boarding house. But when this was built in 1880, it was lakeside. Galpin Lake went right up almost to the back door of this, and there were no railroad tracks or anything there. So this was actually a very desirable location, and you had 3 stories there. It wasn't a very big hotel, boarding house. It only operated 1883 to 1886, but it's still there today. And then we have the Clark House, one of Excelsior's oldest buildings, 1858. James and Susan Clark built the back portion of the house. In 1880, they brought this building in from an unlocation in Excelsior and just slapped it onto the side of the original building. It continued operating as a boarding house until about 1905, and it was 1990 or 1980s or so where it became a boarding house again and continues in that fashion to this day. It's now the guest house. Now this is the last picture of my slideshow, and it's not Excelsior. It's not even really Lake Minnetonka. This is over on Old Excelsior Boulevard. It's 2 houses west of Sparrow Road. This is my great-grandparents' house. And it looks like any house of the period. It was built in 1908, and it's the style, the massing, everything is very indicative of 1908. Unless you look at the windows, and here you have 2-over-2 windows. By 1881, having a 2-over-2 window was very passé. It just wasn't done. They were all 1-over-1. And so this is a real anomaly. It's not until you find out that this house was made from the salvage of Hotel St. Louis that had been demolished in 1907 that it starts to make sense. And I use this picture for the end of the program because it's only by studying the history that we can explain our environs today. So if you have any questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them.
There were at least 2 buildings that were burned as a result of a New Year's Eve party. And I'm wondering, is that during the dry years?
The question about whether it was the dry years when the New Year's Eve party fires occurred, yes, those were dry years. But most of the fires were caused by chimney flue fires. Yeah, burning wood. Yes.
Do you have any info about the Hotel Del Otero?
The Hotel Del Otero, she wants to know about that. Some people mistakenly believe it was built by James J. Hill, but it had nothing to do with James J. Hill. It was just built along his line. Was it George Hopkins? I think it was George Hopkins that built it. And he had formerly operated a hotel on the Great Northern Rail Line in, I think it was Moorhead. And so he came down here. There may have been some communication with Hill, but it was all his money that built the hotel in 1892. And it then passed to the hands in the 20th century to a guy named King and burned July 17th, 1946.
Scott, was there a Keewatin Hotel?
There was there a Keewatin Hotel? There was a Keewatin Hotel over in Cottagewood. It was built by a guy named Henry Schomburg in 1904, 2 years after his Cottagewood Hotel had burned. And was it 1924 that it itself burned?
When was the first fire station put in Excelsior?
When was the first fire station put in Excelsior? Boy, I can't remember. The first, when was it, 1891 that the Excelsior Volunteer Fire Department was organized. It wasn't much of a fire department. It was some ladders and buckets was all it was. In the 1890s, they They did get firefighting apparatus, but it was more chemicals than it was actual water. So even then, it didn't do much good, but the first fire department would have been housed in what is where the old fire station is on 3rd Street right now. The old town hall was built 1886, and then they devoted part of it to the fire station in the 1890s.
Scott, did you ever come across any information about how they staff these huge hotels and the effect on the community and work opportunities?
Question was about staffing of the hotels. Most of the small boarding houses was just family, and there were a lot of women that staffed the hotels because operating a boarding house was one of the socially acceptable places of employment for a single woman or a divorced woman. So that's where a lot of women gravitated to. The larger hotels had black help at the hotels. Hotel St. Louis had a large contingent of the black community of Winchester, Kentucky that came to Lake Minnetonka for the summers to staff the hotel. There was also black staff at Hotel Lafayette predominantly. And I don't know about the Lake Park Hotel.
I live in a cottage that's outside of the Lake Park Hotel where the rail line goes across the property. And I actually have heard that it's where the women worked, like in the hotel, would live in these 4 boarding houses. And I don't know the full history, but it's like one of the ancillary cottages. But it was built in 1910, so the fact that the hotel was crushed in 1913.
Well, there's a couple things going on with the cottages in Tonka Bay. Built in 1910, it wouldn't have been related to the Lake Park Hotel or Tonka Bay Hotel. The Tonka Bay Hotel actually had its own hotel called Pioneer Hotel that was housed 100 staff members exclusively. It was only for the staff. But then there was another Tonka Bay Hotel starting, I think it was 1914, that was operated by a woman, Minnie Prieb. And she expanded that to more than just her lone building and had cottages aside from that. And then that expanded, eventually became Curly's Resort. And then Cheryl's dad bought it, I think, from Curly.
What was the hotel that had the original Surfside Casino?
The hotel that had the original Surfside Casino, that would have been the Chapman House over in Mound.
When was the last operational hotel on the lake?
There's one in Wayzata right now. But the operational hotel, it depends on what you want to consider hotel. There was Christmas Lake Resort, and there were other resorts like that. There was one over in Beaterwood as well, over on Stubbs Bay, that went into the 50s, 60s, and Christmas Lake Resort went down in the 1970s, I believe. But Sampson House might have been one of the last that operated as a hotel. And even at the end there in 1960, 61, it was more of a rooming house than it was hotel. Well, thank you all for coming, and safe travels home.